Let's look again at Mary's song here. Now, if you're someone who fears God, and what does fearing God mean? Does somebody want to make sure we're all on the same page on that? Somebody want to give us a little hint on what fearing God means? Yeah, something along those lines, respecting or honoring God. It's not necessarily like quaking with absolute terror or fear or something like that as we think about. But yeah, more of a respect or honoring or faith or trust. Yeah, something along those lines. So if you have that fear of the Lord, if you know that He has performed those mighty deeds, if you've experienced His mercy, if you are one of, should we say, humble stature? Of course, that always, how do you know if you're humble or not? I don't know. We've seen Him, if you're hungry both in, I suppose, a literal way and a spiritual way, if you're hungry for God, this is good news to people who fear God. On the other hand, if you don't have that, that's not all that great of news. So it kind of depends on who you are, whether Mary's song is positive or negative on your life. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? If you're one who fears God, this is really good news because God is lifting those people up. If, on the other hand, you're those who are not too interested in that, if you're one of the proud, if you're one of the, shall we say, rich, if you have no time for God, this Jesus isn't quite such good news. And we'll see that in the reception that Jesus gets. For some, He's great news. He's the Savior of the world. And for others, they hang Him on a cross. So it depends on who you are, whether this is good news or bad news, in kind of a subjective way. Obviously, Jesus is great news no matter who you are, but depending on where you stand with Him and with God, it could be either good news or bad news. So let's. So now that we've got that out of the way, I know I'm somewhat jumping around here this morning, but I want to get back to what we had talked about, to faithfulness in God, and what does that look like in a world where, I think some of Mary's words that she's spoken here have been and are true, but in a way they haven't come true yet. If we think about it, if we look at this, have we experienced God's mercy personally? I would say yes. I have anyway, and if you're here this morning, I would think to one degree or another you have experienced God's mercy, whether that would be in the form of salvation or some other small step of, that's a big step of faith, but some other step of faith, that we have experienced God's mercy. Yes, Mary is right. His mercy, verse 50, extends to those who fear Him from generation to generation. Verse 51, He has performed mighty deeds with His arm. Now we can read in Scripture and read about the mighty deeds that He has done, but I think if we think about our own lives, we have seen God work in mighty ways. I know some of your stories I don't know so well, but I know of some of the mighty things that He has done in your life. Tracy, Bella's kind of an example of that for you guys. And just thinking of my life and some of your lives and other families, people's lives, we've seen God's mighty deeds and what He has done and what He continues to do. We have seen Him, verse 51, those who are proud, we have seen the proud humbled. We have seen God do that. We have seen, whether it would be CEOs of major corporations, we've seen God humble those people overnight. We have seen Him, verse 52, bring down rulers from their thrones. Watching on the news before I came this morning, they're talking more about Muammar Gaddafi, talk about an almighty person now kind of being on the run for all we know. Ones who were mighty have been cast down. He has filled the hungry with good things. We know He takes care of even just on basic human needs, God filling the hungry. And we have seen Him send the rich away empty. We've got the recent economic downturn that those who had it all are left with nothing. So we see that God has done these things, that He is mindful of His servant. He looks after His people. And I think we know that and we see that, yet we've also got this very clear evidence in the world that we live in that not all of this has come to fruition or come to reality yet. We do see God grant mercy, but not all rulers that shouldn't be in place are, there you go, thank you, Tom, have been removed. You know, there's still dictators out there. There are people out there who shouldn't be in power that still wield enormous amounts of power. The humble haven't always been lifted up. As much as we would like, the hungry still starve to death. The rich seem to get richer, and the poor seem to get poorer if we just look at our society. And sometimes it just doesn't always seem that God always remembers His people. I think we've all been in situations that we think, God, man, where in the world are you in this? I have no idea.
I think Pastor Joshua, basically Rick, what you're talking about is people that are wealthy and think they've got there on their own are not getting any blessings from God. They've already got everything that they want.
Sure.
They've got money. But
Sure.
really not, they just tend to make empty because
Not
they
getting
really
anything?
don't have anything. They just
Sure.
have money. That's all
Yeah.
they have.
Yeah.
So that, they're looking for themselves for their own blessings, and they're not getting anything from God. So
Mhm.
that one's going to fulfill probably what they want.
Sure. Yeah, and Tom, you could certainly look at it that way. The bigger issue still stands, though, that there's things in here that we haven't seen fully come to fruition yet. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the promises that God has made to be faithful, yet we don't always see that happen yet? And I think the important part of that is the yet. You know, that Mary realized that everything that was going on that God promised back in the Old Testament was beginning or was coming to reality in this guy called Jesus. And it started, in one way it started back then, but it starts with Jesus. Jesus is bringing it into flesh in a way that was never done before. Jesus' kingdom, and we don't have time to get into all of that, I'm running out of time here, but Jesus started something 2,000 years ago that's continuing to this day and is going to continue till He comes again. So if we ask the question, is God faithful even when it doesn't look like it? What's the answer to that? It is. He is. Is God faithful? Yeah, He is. It may not be yet in the full-blown way that Mary talks about it here, but we know that God's faithful even if it doesn't always look like it. And that's a really hard thing to grasp. It's not an easy thing to deal with, whether it's just in our own lives or talking with people who are struggling. God's faithful, but we might not always see it. But we've got that promise from God that what He started way back thousands of years ago, what He started and continued with Jesus is going to continue to this day, and it will continue into the future till He comes again and sets everything right. And that's something that we really can't take too lightly, I don't think. That even when things don't look good, if you look at Mary, things in her life weren't looking all that great at this point yet either. She's still an unwed mother. She's still in Nazareth. She doesn't have a whole lot going for her. If God didn't come through for her on this, if God wasn't faithful, she was going to be an unwed mother in a culture that ostracized unwed mothers. She really had nothing going for her. She had nothing to fall back on except the promises and faithfulness of God. And I hope we can always find ourselves in that same boat, realizing that in all reality, we don't have a whole lot to fall back on except the faithfulness and promises of God. So where do we go from here? What do we do? What do we do for us? God's faithfulness is coming true. It came true 2,000 years ago in Jesus. It's still coming true to this day as Jesus' stories continue. And it will fully come true one day in the future. Again, I always like to, we've always got to ask the question, what difference does this make for us? How is this supposed to shape our lives or make us different? From a pastor's perspective, some sermons are better at that than others. So, but we've always got to work at that. What is Luke, what is the Spirit doing in this text in our lives to make us different people when we read it, after we've read it, than from where we started? So some of the questions that we need to mull about here or think about over this that we've got to answer is, what difference does it make in our lives here today to know that God is faithful even when it may not always look like it? How does that change the way we live our lives? How does that change the way we look at our lives? How does that change the way we interact with people? That God is always faithful even when it may not fully look like it. And that's kind of a big question to answer. Anybody have any thoughts on that? How does this story of Mary alter the way or change the way we live our lives as Christians, or how should it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Like these things haven't come to fruition yet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder to us that we're supposed to be part of that faithfulness. So that, those little things that we can do, be humble, to help out people that are less fortunate than ourselves. That's on us. And we're supposed to do that to make it become full.
And Tom, that's an awesome point. That's like a sermon in itself. It's so good though, because did everybody hear what Tom said? That we are a part of these promises coming true and this faithfulness being lived out. I think we can fall into the trap saying, oh, God's faithful. There are hungry people out there. There are so many whatever bad things going on out there. Let's just hang out and wait for God to come and make everything right, and that's all there is to it. But Tom's pointing out that God has put us here, again, getting back to our mission, to be something for Him and to do something. And part of that is to be part of this kingdom that's coming in, being part of that faithfulness, and bringing some of this to fruition through the way that we are faithful to Jesus and the way that we live our lives. So that's an excellent point, that part of this is the way that we live our lives and the way that we shine Christ and show Christ to others. So Tom, that is awesome. Yeah, you hit that right on the head. Yeah. Any comments on what Tom said or other things? How does this change the way that we live, or what transformation needs to take place as we walk away from what Mary has to say or what Luke has to say?